Ever feel like managing SQL Server is kind of like, well, wandering through a maze, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But imagine if you could just like zoom out and get these bird's eye view of everything
Right.
and then control it all like with the power of code, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're diving into today. It's all about using PowerShell to automate your SQL Server tasks.
Right.
And seriously, unlock a whole other level of control. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, whether you're like a hardcore database administrator, a DBA,
Right.
or you're just getting started with SQL Server,
Right.
learning to use PowerShell can be a total game changer.
For sure. For sure.
It's all about making those boring tasks, the ones that take forever,
Yeah.
making those things run automatically so you can focus on other things.
Right.
Way fewer errors, right?
Absolutely.
And you get a much deeper understanding of what's happening, like behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes. Yeah.
Our guide for this deep dive is SQL Server 2014 with PowerShell V5 Cookbook. It's by Donabel Santos.
Okay, cool.
Now, you might think, wait, 2014? Is that like ancient history?
Yeah.
But honestly, the main ideas in it are still super relevant today.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like finding some timeless strategies, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like hidden in this amazing cookbook.
Yeah.
Donabel Santos, she's a real expert in all this. I mean, she's a SQL Server MVP.
Wow.
Which is like a Microsoft most valuable professional.
Right.
And she does a ton of stuff. Business intelligence, architect, consultant, trainer. She's an author.
Right.
She's based in Vancouver at her company. It's called QueryWorks Solutions.
Okay.
Works a lot with SQL Server, PowerShell, Tableau, and Power BI.
Right.
And she teaches at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. So her insights are like seriously valuable.
Sure.
If you want to find out more about her, you can go to queryworks.ca,
Okay.
her blog, sqlabel.com,
Okay.
and her Twitter handle is @squirrelbell.
Great.
Now, this cookbook, it wasn't just Donabel, right? She had a whole team of technical reviewers who brought their expertise to it.
Oh, cool.
We got David Cobb, a system architect and a principal consultant at Cobb Information Technologies.
Okay.
His blog is at daveslog.com.
Okay.
Then we have Chrissy Lemaire. She's a PowerShell MVP and a SQL Server DBA at NATO Special Operations Headquarters.
Wow.
She tweets as @CL.
Okay.
And she's got a couple of websites, blog.netnerds.net and realkejunrecipes.com.
Great.
We also have Patrick Lindstrom. He's a DevOps consultant in Scandinavia.
Okay.
And then Fabrice Romillard, a DevOps engineer and a Microsoft MVP in Geneva.
Awesome.
So we've got a lot of practical, real-world experience baked into this book.
Yeah, that sounds like a great team.
What's really cool is that they've created this like super hands-on guide, right?
Right.
So our goal, our mission in this deep dive is to kind of pull out some of these really useful recipes.
Okay.
The surprising things you can actually do when you combine SQL Server with PowerShell.
Yes.
And, really we want to show you how it can simplify these complex tasks. Make them more manageable.
Yeah, that's
Whether
right.
you're a developer, a DBA, whatever.
Right.
So let's start with the basics, right?
Okay.
One of the things that I thought was cool right away was how you can launch PowerShell, like right from SQL Server Management Studio
Oh, okay.
or SSMS, right?
Yeah.
That integration, right?
Yeah, SSMS.
Talk about a time saver.
Yeah.
So if you right-click on a server or a database in SSMS, you often see this option to start PowerShell.
Okay.
It's like opening up a command prompt that's already focused on like exactly what you need in SQL Server.
Right.
Now, the book goes on to explain how to find those specific PowerShell tools that are meant for working with SQL Server.
Right.
And they talk about these things called CMDlets and modules.
Okay.
Specifically, they mention SQL PS and SQL SCMDLE lachetes,
Okay.
which sounds a little jargony. So what's like the main thing we need to know about those?
So basically, you can think of CMDlets as these pre-built tools for SQL Server management.
Okay.
Like each one's designed to do a specific job,
Gotcha.
like getting information about your databases or starting a service.
Okay.
They have this consistent naming pattern. It's a verb like get, set, or start, followed by a noun like command, service, database.
Okay, so it's kind of like it tells you what it's going to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Now, SQL PS is the module that has the CMDlets for general SQL Server administration,
Okay.
while SQL CMDlets, that focuses on analysis services.
Okay.
You can actually see all the SQL-related CMDlets that are available on your system
Okay.
by running the get command name SQL in PowerShell.
Okay.
And if you want to start using those SQL PS CMDLets,
Yeah.
you would usually run import module NAS name SQL PS.
Okay.
Interestingly, the book mentions that the analysis services CMDLets, they often load automatically when you load the main SQL PS module.
Oh, that's convenient. So
Mhm.
it's about like having the right tools at your fingertips.
Exactly, yeah.
So the book talks about creating a SQL Server instance object.
Go on.
And it uses this command, new object dash type name, Microsoft.SQL Server.management.smo server.argumentless instance name.
Right.
Now that kind of looks a little bit like programming, right?
Yeah, it is.
What's actually going on there?
So that's where PowerShell starts talking directly to SQL Server using something called SMO.
Okay.
That's short for SQL Server Management Objects.
Okay.
So think of SMO as like that's a set of digital building blocks that represent every part of your SQL Server.
Okay.
So the server itself, the databases, the tables, all those things.
Gotcha.
So this specific command creates a PowerShell object that represents a specific SQL Server instance.
Okay.
An instance name, that would be the name of your server.
Okay.
And what's really cool is how it handles security.
Okay.
So by default, it tries to connect using your Windows login. But if you need to use a specific SQL Server username and password, you can set the server.connectioncontext.set login secure false property,
Okay.
and then use the get credential CMDlet.
Okay.
And that'll securely prompt you for your credentials.
So it's really flexible for different ways you might need to connect.
Exactly, yeah.
So this server object, it seems like that's the central point for kind of navigating everything within SQL Server, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The book mentions this SMO hierarchy. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the server object is kind of at the top of this hierarchy.
Okay.
From there, it contains collections of other objects,
Okay.
like databases, configuration, SQL mail, login collection. Each of these collections, they hold individual objects.
Okay.
So for example, the databases collection,
Yeah.
that contains individual database objects.
Right.
And then each database object in turn contains tables,
Okay.
and so on and so on.
So it's like a tree.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The book actually mentions this SMO object model diagram on MSDN,
Okay.
which is like this visual map to help you understand how all these pieces fit together.
Okay.
And in PowerShell, the get member CMDlet, that's your key to exploring the properties and the capabilities of each of those objects.
Gotcha.
Right.
So if I wanted to see all the things I could do with a specific database, I could grab that database object and use getMember and it would show me.
Yeah, you got it.
Awesome.
It's all about digging deeper into this object model.
Yeah.
The book also talks about how to list those SQL Server instances that are running on a machine
Okay.
and how to find out about their services.
Huh.
And they use something called WMI for that, which is Windows Management Instrumentation,
Okay.
with the command get WMI object-class serial service.
Okay.
Now, WMI, that sounds a little technical.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So what is that, and why is that important for us?
So WMI, it's kind of like Windows' way of giving you a central place to manage all sorts of information about your system, like the software that's running, which includes SQL Server.
Right.
The book mentions that it follows WBM,
Okay.
which is kind of a broader industry standard for managing computer systems.
Okay.
So by using WMI, you can get a pretty comprehensive view of your SQL Server services.
Right.
You know, things like their names, how they're displayed, what type of service they are.
Uh-huh.
The book even shows you how to filter specifically for SQL Server services
Okay.
using a command that essentially says, you know, just show me the services where the SQL service type is equal to 1.
Gotcha.
And then you can build on that.
Right.
You can use PowerShell's get service CMDlet,
Uh-huh.
and then you can combine that with start service and stop service to actually manage those SQL Server services.
Right, right.
The book gives an example of how you can take a list of SQL Server service names
Okay.
and write a script to automatically start or stop them as needed.
Right.
But there is one thing to watch out for, right? Sometimes the status might say started, even if the service is still kind of like getting going. It's still in the process of fully starting up. So it's good to know about that potential delay.
So don't assume it's fully ready immediately.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So we've talked about starting and stopping, but what about like the actual settings and the configuration of SQL Server?
Right.
Can PowerShell help us there?
Oh, absolutely.
How so?
So you can access those running configuration settings, the run value,
Okay.
as well as the settings that are configured but might need a restart to actually take effect.
Oh.
That's the config value.
Right.
By exploring the server settings and server configuration SMO objects.
Okay.
what's really cool is that you can then use the alter method to make changes to those settings directly through code. So the book gives an example of how you can list these values and even change the authentication mode of the SQL Server instance. Like between Windows authentication and mixed mode. So it's a very direct way to modify those server properties. Which can be a lot faster and more consistent than clicking through all those options in SSMS.
Oh, that's way more efficient than like manually navigating all those properties.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about managing the things that live inside SQL Server, right? The databases and their objects. You know, for developers or anybody who needs to manage these, the idea of being able to like script database objects, like stored procedures, seems incredibly valuable, right?
Oh, yeah.
So how does PowerShell handle that?
So that's where things get really interesting. Those SMO objects for database objects, like DLBO stored procedures or DLB user-defined functions, they have a script method. So you can write a PowerShell script that goes through all the stored procedures in a database. And for each one, it can call that script method to generate that T-SQL code that creates the procedure. And the book highlights how you can actually customize this scripting process using the script options file name property to automatically save each script to its own file. And you can even name those files based on the database and the object's name. It specifically shows how you can filter out system objects and even choose not to script encrypted stored procedures if you need to.
So you could basically automate the process of backing up the code, like the definition of all your stored procedures.
Yeah, precisely.
Amazing.
It's a really great way to manage version control of your database logic. Or even just easily recreate database objects in another environment. And speaking of creating things, the book also shows you how to create entire databases. And the tables within them using SMO.
So walk me through that. Creating a table with PowerShell sounds pretty advanced.
Yeah, it involves creating some new SMO objects. So first you'd create an object representing the table itself. And you would use new object Microsoft.SQL-Server.management.smo.table. Then you add columns to the table's columns collection. Using the table.columns.add method where you specify the column name and its data type. You can even create primary keys by creating a new index object. Using new object Microsoft.SQL-Server.management.smo.index. Setting properties like whether it's clustered and which columns are part of the key. Once you've defined all the columns in the indexes, you just tell SQL Server to create the table by calling the table create method. It's a very structured way to define your database structure. Which can be really useful for consistency.
Yeah, that's super powerful.
Yeah.
So what about other database objects like views?
So creating a view is a little bit different. The key there is the text body property of the view object. So you can directly assign the T-SQL definition of the view to this property. The book actually mentions using here strings. That's syntax in PowerShell. Which lets you define multi-line text really easily within your script. Which makes the view definition a lot more readable.
Right.
Than the PowerShell code.
Makes sense.
And if you want to get into some more advanced scenarios, you can even create encrypted stored procedures. Simply by setting the isEncrypted property of the stored procedure object to true before you create it.
Wow, that's a lot of control.
Yeah.
So what if you need to run SQL queries or even like whole SQL scripts from within PowerShell? How'd you do that?
So for that, you would use the invoke CQ LCMD CMDlet. Think of that as your direct line to execute code into SQL Server from PowerShell. It lets you run SQL queries against a specific SQL Server instance database that you specify. You can even take the results of a query and pipe them to other PowerShell CMDlets. For example, using export CSV to save the data to a comma-separated file. The book gives a good example of selecting data from a table and then exporting that data to a CSV file using this CMDlet.
So that sounds like a pretty fundamental task for automation. Being able to query and export data easily.
Exactly, yeah.
So what about when you need to move larger amounts of data in and out of SQL Server.
Okay.
The book mentions the BCP utility and the BLK insert command.
Right.
So tell me about those.
So for those really high-speed, large-scale data operations, you can directly use the BCP command line utility. That stands for Bulk Copy Program. From within PowerShell.
Gotcha.
So the book shows you how to build the BCP command string within your PowerShell script to do a bulk export. You're basically pulling data from a SQL Server table to a file. You're building the command with all the necessary details, and then you execute it. Now, for importing large amounts of data, you can use the BOK insert tsql command combined with invoke COKOCMD.
Gotcha.
The book gives an example of how you can read data from a CSV file. And then insert it into a SQL Server table using this method. It even shows you how you might first create a temporary table or a staging table to hold the data during the import process.
So PowerShell is kind of like the conductor here?
Yeah, exactly.
Bringing together these powerful command line tools and the SQL command when you need to move a lot of data quickly.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is really efficient.
It is.
Now let's move on to some basic administration tasks.
Okay, great.
One thing that I often find myself needing to check is those service accounts that SQL Server is running under. How can PowerShell help us with that?
So the book outlines a couple of ways to get that information. You can use WMI again. Querying specific areas under root Microsoft SQL Server to find details about the services and the accounts they're using. Alternatively, a more direct approach might be to use that get WMI object CMA lot, targeting the Win32 service class, and then filtering those results to only show services related to SQL Server. The book provides an example of how to retrieve the service name, the display name, and the service account using this method, and then format the output to make it easier to read.
Great. So that's great for a quick audit of your service accounts.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about changing like fundamental server settings? Like the authentication mode. I know that can sometimes be kind of buried in that SSMS interface.
Yeah, it can be.
So how can PowerShell help us there?
So PowerShell gives you a pretty direct way to do that. Using the server settings.login mode property. Now the book mentions that this property can have 4 different values. Normal, integrated, mixed, and unknown. You just set this property to the mode that you want. So you might use a specific value that represents mixed mode. And then you call the server mode to actually apply the change. Just remember, you might need to restart the SQL Server service for that change to really take effect.
Makes sense.
And the book recommends refreshing the server object in PowerShell afterwards. Just to see the updated value.
Good to know.
Yeah.
So that's a much more streamlined way to handle that important server setting. Another really common task for administrators is checking those SQL Server error logs. Can PowerShell help us sift through all that information?
It absolutely can.
So
the server object, it has a read error log method, which, as you might guess, reads that SQL Server error log and returns a collection of all the entries. You can then use PowerShell's filtering capabilities, like the where object CM DLIT, to look for specific keywords or entries within a certain date range. The book gives an example of how you can filter for all the error log entries that contain the word failed that occurred after a specific date. And it displays those results in an easy-to-read table.
So that allows you to quickly find and investigate issues. Programmatically, rather than having to manually scroll through like huge log files.
Massive log files, yeah.
So that sounds incredibly useful for like, monitoring proactively and troubleshooting.
Absolutely.
What about managing the users within a specific database? I mean, listing them, seeing their properties, the permissions they have. I mean, that can be really time-consuming in SSMS.
It can be, yeah.
So what can we do with PowerShell there?
So PowerShell with SMO makes this really scriptable. So the database object, it has a user's collection that gives you access to all the database users. You can iterate through this collection. And for each user, you can easily see their properties, like their associative login and the database roles they belong to. The database object also has an enum object permissions method, which lets you list all the permissions
Okay.
that have been granted to a specific user on various database objects.
Gotcha.
The book provides a script that pulls together all this information.
Okay.
The database users, their key properties,
Right.
and their object permission,
Okay.
and formats it all into a nice custom PowerShell object,
Right.
which makes it much easier to read and understand.
So that's great for auditing database security, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And just understanding who has access to what.
Yeah, for sure.
So what about the process of actually creating new database users
Okay.
and then linking them to existing SQL Server logins?
Right.
How do we do that?
The book explains exactly how to do that.
Okay.
So first, you create a new user object
Okay.
within the database.users collection.
Right.
Using new object Microsoft.SQL server.management.small but user.
Okay.
Specify the database you're working with and the desired username for this new database user.
Okay.
Then you set the login property of that new user object
Okay.
to the name of an existing SQL Server login.
Okay.
Finally, you tell SQL Server to actually create the user in the database by calling that debuter create method.
Okay.
The book even points back to an earlier section on creating logins.
Yeah. Okay.
If you need to create the SQL Server login first.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So that makes managing database access much more scriptable.
Yeah.
Something you could repeat across multiple databases
Exactly.
if you needed to.
Uh-huh.
Now, another critical part of database administration is managing backups.
Yeah.
And PowerShell just seems like it'd be perfect for automating those backup tasks.
Yeah. You're absolutely right.
So tell me about that.
So the backup SQL database, CMDLit,
Okay.
that gives you a really straightforward way to do those different types of backups.
Right.
Full backups,
Uh-huh.
differential backups,
Okay.
which only backup changes since the last full backup,
Oh, right.
and transaction log backups,
Okay.
which capture all the transaction log records.
Right.
You can specify the database you want to back up,
Uh-huh.
the location where you want to save the backup file,
Okay.
and then various other options, like whether to compress the backup,
Okay.
whether to do a checksum
Right.
to verify the backup's integrity.
Gotcha.
All is simple parameters to the CMDLit.
Okay.
The book gives you clear examples of how to create each type of backup using the CMDLit.
Okay.
It also goes into using that SMO backup object directly,
Right.
which gives you even more fine-grained control over the backup process,
Okay.
including things like setting up notifications,
Okay.
for when a backup starts or finishes.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So you can get emails or
exactly.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So you have that simplicity, the ease of use of the CMDLit for common backup tasks.
Right.
And then you have that more detailed control of those SMO objects for those more advanced or customized backup scenarios.
Yeah, exactly.
So what about other routine database maintenance tasks?
Okay.
Like detaching and then reattaching databases? Expert.